Welcome to Her Story, the podcast that brings to life the stories of incredible women throughout history. Each episode uncovers the remarkable lives, achievements, and struggles of women who shaped the world, beyond the textbooks and headlines. Join us as we celebrate their legacies and inspire new generations with tales of courage, resilience, and trailblazing spirit. Hello. Today we are going to be revisiting an episode I recorded last year with the wonderful Natalie Grueninger on the final year of Anne Boleyn. We are revisiting this episode to commemorate the execution of Queen Anne Boleyn on the 19th of May, 1536. Natalie Grueninger is an independent researcher who specialises in the life, reign and times of Queen Anne Boleyn. She's authored and co-authored 7 books, including the In the Footsteps series. Her latest book, The Final Year of Anne Boleyn, was published in November 2022. Natalie has written for a number of history magazines, including Inside History and Tudor Places, and runs the website www.onthetudortrail.com. She's the creator and host of the popular Talking Tudors podcast and the founder of Women's History Circle, dedicated to amplifying women's voices and promoting the work of women creatives with a passion for history. Natalie is deeply interested in the lives of medieval and Tudor women and in the networks which they built and used, especially those with other women. She's an avid bibliophile and a lifelong learner. When not at her desk, she can often be found indulging in her insatiable passion for travel. Natalie lives in Sydney with her husband, 2 children, and a cheeky cavadoodle. Let us get into today's old episode. Natalie, welcome to the Tudor Her Story.
Hello, how are you? It's wonderful to be here.
I'm fine, thank you. So today we are talking about your most recent book, The Final Year of Anne Boleyn. But you are also the author of In the Footsteps of Anne Boleyn and In the Footsteps of the 6 Wives of Henry VIII, with your good friend Sarah Morris.
That's right, yeah.
And you are also the successful podcaster of Talking Tudors. So I thought we could talk a little bit about you because you are well known in the Tudor community. And I thought it'd be good to ask, where did your interest in history first begin?
That's such a good question. Do you know, I can't actually remember a sort of point when my love of history began. I just feel like it was always there. Like I was born with this kind of love of the past. I've always had a very interesting relationship with the past and have enjoyed learning about people that were here before us, basically, and walking in the footsteps of people that were here before us. So I love all things old. I'm a fan of, vintage clothing, furniture. I don't know why I feel more comfortable in more older vintage surroundings than I do in, say, kind of modern architecture or something like this. So yeah, I just always feel like I've loved history and loved the past. But Tudor history actually came a little bit later in my life.
I was just going to say, what drew you to the Tudors?
Yes, because obviously if my accent hasn't given me away, I'm a born and bred Sydney sider. So we don't actually learn about Tudor history as part of our curriculum for history at school. So perhaps I came across them at some point, but I don't actually remember. The first point I do know that I kind of went, oh, this is interesting, is when my sister lent me a book, The Secret Diary of Anne Boleyn by Robin Maxwell. And she had read it and said, oh, this is such a great read. I think you'll enjoy it, and passed it on to me. And I have to say, I was quite taken aback. It was just a period of history I hadn't learned anything about, to be honest, but I was immediately really drawn to it. And so that was the first thing that kind of sparked my interest in the Tudors. But then not long after, I went on a European tour, and I had a few days in London before sort of joining that tour and going around Europe. And again, on the recommendation of my sister, she said, oh, you have to go to the Tower of London and you have to go to Hampton Court. So I thought, okay, I'll go. I had no idea what they were sort of about. And I just completely fell in love. I could not believe that, something of that age still survived and that it was connected to this woman, Anne Boleyn, that I'd read about in Robin's book. And it was just a sort of snowball effect. I just wanted to learn more. And that was, I was in my early 20s then. So it's been a good 25 years of studying the Tudors now. So they are certainly a big part of my life.
Oh no, that's wonderful. I mean, I think Anne Boleyn is everyone's gateway into Tudor history. She was definitely mine. Actually, my first Anne Boleyn book was In the Footsteps of Anne Boleyn by
Oh,
yourself.
wow.
And then I was like, well, I need to go to all these Tudor buildings because you don't realize what exists when it comes to Anne Boleyn. I think there's a bit of a misconception that everything was destroyed in relation to Anne Boleyn. When you start looking, so much does actually survive.
It does. You're right.
Why did you start your website on the Tudor Trail?
Yeah, so I started that in 2009. So I'd already been studying the Tudors for a little bit, just doing personal study. It wasn't formal study at that point. And I have a fascination with places. So apart from always kind of loving history, I've always loved learning about stories of the past while I'm actually standing in the spot where it happened, where it played out. So I decided that I was going to go on what I called a Tudor pilgrimage with my sister in 2000. I think we were planning it in 2008. And so what I was doing was sort of scouring the internet, looking for a kind of definitive list of places associated with Anne that we could visit, because I knew there had to be places. And this same sort of small handful, Hampton Court, Hever Castle, Tower of London, kept coming up. And I thought, well, there must be other locations. So I set a task for myself, a bit of a challenge, to look for these places and to document them on my website, hence the name On the Tudor Trail. It's actually got a little subtitle, Retracing the Steps of Anne Boleyn. So that was the kind of original idea behind it, mainly to help us with our trip that we were going on. And I very quickly discovered that, yes, there were a lot more places that Anne had visited apart from the sort of five, 4 or 5 that we get told about all the time. So I started writing little blog posts, just researching, putting up some pictures. I traveled to a few of them on that first trip, and that just grew and grew. And then, of course, the website evolved from there into lots of other things. But to begin with, it was just a place to document locations associated with Anne. Of course, that then led to the collaboration with Sarah Morris that you've mentioned in the Footsteps of Anne Boleyn, where we documented pretty much all the known locations that Anne visited.
No, that I think that's wonderful because your website is still popular to many history nerds today because I think you've taken the effort to find these locations and people then go to these places because you've recommended it. Is this where your podcast was then kind of born after the website?
Yeah, so On the Tudor Trail was established in 2009, and then the podcast wasn't. I didn't start the podcast until 2018. So there's quite a gap. So in that time, I was writing books. So I wrote a number of books apart from the two in the Footsteps books that you mentioned. I also wrote one called Discovering Tudor London. So again, related to places and telling the stories of the Tudors through these great houses that they once occupied. I also collaborated with Catherine Holman on a couple of coloring books. So I was quite busy doing all of that. But then, yes, the idea of talking Tudors popped into my head, and I thought, oh, okay, this is interesting because I can't even remember having listened to a podcast before then, to be honest with you. So it was a bit of a leap of faith, but it felt like a really inspired idea. So I went for it. And, we're now 6 years into the future, millions of downloads, lots of great listeners, and it's just been such an incredible journey.
No, that's wonderful too. I mean, your podcast is amazing. I listen to it all the time. I'll go back to episodes I've already listened to because I find it's a bit of a comfort podcast show for me.
Oh, well, that's lovely to hear.
What made you want to write about the final year of Anne's life?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think since I started reading about Anne's story, of course, I started like everyone else. You start reading the popular biographies, you read some fiction, and then, of course, you have questions yourself that you want to try and answer. And I had a lot of questions, I have to say, a lot of questions that had come up over the years. I'd also realized that there were a lot of misconceptions about this particular period of Anne's life. I've run multiple social media accounts since about 2010, actually. So I knew that there were things that kept coming up constantly that were just not correct. They just weren't grounded in fact. So part of me wanted to do a bit of myth busting. Another part of me wanted to challenge myself to come up with an answer. Why did she have to die? And in all the years that I've been studying Anne, I'd never written a blog post about her death, nothing at all. I'd never tackled it because I didn't feel that I was quite there yet. I didn't think I had enough knowledge. But then I decided that it was time. And so I delved very deep into those last kind of 18 months of Anne's life and did come up, I think, with a plausible scenario that led to her execution. And it involves so much more than what we are often told. And it's a really fascinating period of Anne's life. So I really enjoyed it, but it was very difficult as well to write about something that ended so brutally and that was so incredibly unjust as well.
No, I agree with you. I mean, I would recommend any of my listeners to purchase your book. It was wonderful the detail you went into for them final 18 months. And I think it was quite refreshing not just to read January 1536 to May. It was nice to actually get a bit of a background into 1535 as well, which I think is good on you for, for doing an Anne Boleyn justice.
Yeah, thank you. I think that that context is so important. And as you say, when we, other things that have come out about her downfall usually focus on January to May 1536. And I already knew that there was so much that happened before that that contributed to what happened to Anne. And without that kind of knowledge, you don't get the full picture. So I definitely wanted to investigate those months as well.
No, absolutely. So the first part of your book is spring 1535. And should we, I thought, would you like to mention what had happened up to 1535 in terms of Anne's queenship?
Yes, yeah. So there's a lot there. So I'll try and do a bit of a summary of some of the sort of main points. So your listeners, I'm sure, are probably aware that there's so much about Anne that we don't know that's debated, and that includes her wedding to Henry VIII. So we think that there was some kind of formal agreement made in November 1532. We have a couple of sources for that, quite reliable sources. It then appears that they had another sort of wedding ceremony on the 25th of January in 1533. Again, a private ceremony, very few people in attendance, but that really formalized and solidified their union. So she is Henry's queen by the end of January 1533. I suppose a couple of months after that, Thomas Cranmer, who is certainly a Boleyn supporter, he is consecrated as the new Archbishop of Canterbury because the previous year, a person called William Warham, who was not very friendly with the Boleyns and certainly not comfortable with Henry wanting to annul his marriage without papal authority. So we now have Cranmer in that very important position, and the Pope did in fact authorize the consecration of Thomas Cranmer, luckily for Anne and Henry. So end of March, but by this time Europe really doesn't know exactly what's happened. So even though Anne's been Henry's wife for a couple of months, it's a bit of a secret. So not everyone kind of knows. Even in April, the ambassadors are still kind of just, oh, we think maybe he's been married for a while now. It's not very clear yet. But anyway, at the end of March, Anne's household is formed. And then on the 12th of April, which is a really important date, 1533, she attends Mass as Queen for the first time. So with her full household in attendance and people paying tribute to her as Queen. It's not until the following month, though, that Cranmer actually annuls Henry's marriage to Catherine. So essentially, Henry's had two wives for, the first 5 months of 1533. We have Anne's spectacular coronation. She's crowned at Westminster Abbey on the 1st of June, 1533. It's an incredible event. It's 4 days of celebrations and pageantry. There's been nothing like this seen for a very long time in the country. This is followed not long after by the birth, of course, of the Princess Elizabeth. So yes, the couple were hoping for a son, of course, but it appears that they got over that quite quickly because Elizabeth was very healthy, very robust baby, and very quickly seemed to be quite an intelligent child. So they were very happy. Um, so that's kind of 1533. Things are very hopeful. Elizabeth's born, and then court life kind of resumes as per normal. In 1534, maybe just one event worth mentioning because it's quite important is that Anne falls pregnant again. So quite quickly she falls pregnant again. But I believe that in the summer of 1534, she has a stillbirth. She has a stillborn baby at probably Hampton Court Palace, which is absolutely crushing and traumatizing for Anne and for Henry as well. So it's, yes, things are getting a little bit tense, I suppose, in the relationship by then.
No, I completely agree. I think obviously the 7 years that Anne and Henry were courting, just it's there's not a quiet day when it comes to their courtship. And then you think
Exactly.
it'll be quiet when they get married, but no, keeps coming. More drama happens.
Yeah, it is. I should add that throughout all of that, there is constant opposition to the marriage. I know we're going to talk a little bit more about sort of what's going on politically and whatnot, but I think it's important to recognize that with the annulment of Catherine of Aragon's marriage, that did not end support for Catherine and Mary. In fact, it probably bolstered it. And people are as reluctant as ever to accept Anne as queen. She's got quite a small support base at court, although there are those that are kind of in the middle. While Henry's happy with her, they're going to behave appropriately with Anne. But then she's got the sort of she's got some staunch supporters, but it is opposition after opposition after opposition.
No, I completely agree. I think obviously Anne wasn't a royal, she was a noble, so she didn't have that mighty European backing that Catherine of Aragon did. But she did have some loyal supporters, but obviously they're not as strong as the Holy Roman Emperor.
No, exactly. That's exactly right.
What did the beginning of 1535 look like for Anne?
Yeah, really stressful, really tense and really, really stressful. So as I've mentioned, she's recovering from what I think was a stillbirth. She also towards the end of 1534, she basically loses her sister and sister-in-law to two different situations. So Mary Boleyn has made a marriage that was not approved by the Boleyn family. So she is basically sent away from court, unfortunately. This causes a serious rift with her and her family. Jane Rochford, Jane Boleyn, Sir George Boleyn's wife, helps Anne get rid of a kind of rival that is hanging around court. And instead of the rival being sent away, which is what Anne intended, Jane Boleyn is exiled from court. So she doesn't have the two closest women to her. Her mother is still there, back and forth between the home at Hever and court. But I think it was a real loss when Mary and Jane were sent away. So that's sort of going on. There are increasing tensions between England and France as well. There was a disastrous embassy towards the end of 1534. So basically, they were trying to negotiate a French match for the Princess Elizabeth. And they were under the impression, Henry and Anne, that that's what the ambassadors were coming over for. And then imagine their shock when they actually suggest a match with the Lady Mary and Francis I's son. They were so disappointed, and Anne was heartbroken because, of course, she'd really supported the French during the early part of her reign. So this is a real issue after that kind of disastrous embassy. Henry suggested a marriage between Elizabeth and Francis's third son, which the French were really kind of indifferent about, and they were just stalling, really. So there was back and forth about that was causing a lot of stress. And we actually know it's quite rare to sort of know Anne's feelings firsthand, but we do because she spoke to the secretary of the Admiral of France in February 1535 and actually told him. She told him how stressed she was feeling and that she knew that all eyes were on her, and she understood that she was in a very precarious situation. And if there was an improvement in negotiations and relations with France, that was going to really leave her in a very, very difficult position. And he basically recorded all of that she said to him. So we know that she was immensely stressed. She feared that she was going to lose the French support that she thought she had. To be honest, I don't know that she ever really had it, but that's what she feared. And she thought that that would be detrimental to her queenship and to her marriage. But it wasn't just relations with other countries that were causing headaches. There were tensions within the family as well. So, for example, with her uncle Norfolk, Thomas Howard, which I'm sure people have heard about, there were tensions there. He was increasingly uncomfortable with Anne's religious leanings, with how she was, managing her queenship. And then neither of those are wallflowers. They're both strong, big personalities. And there was many clashes. In the end, Norfolk left court complaining that he was treated worse than a dog. So there was a lot going on for Anne at that period of time. And of course, she still got that pressure to fall pregnant again, which is a constant for a Tudor queen consort. So it's a tough time for poor Anne.
No, absolutely. I mean, it just seems to be fight after fight. It doesn't seem to be a quiet moment for her. And that must have been incredibly stressful. Obviously, she has the pressure of trying to conceive again, but she's under an undue amount of stress. And I can imagine that was probably very hard to actually try and conceive in that time.
Yeah, well, we know how detrimental stress is to conception, but also just in general. I think her health and her well-being was really, really struggling at this point because of all these incredible pressures that had just not, they were just not stopping, and there was no sign that they were going to end. It's and her knowing that people are watching her. So you feel even more like, oh goodness, one misstep and everyone's going to, be reporting it. So it's incredibly challenging time.
No, absolutely. At this time, were things okay with Henry and Anne, or were things getting a bit rocky between them as well?
Yeah, I think, and several authors have described their relationship as sunshine and storms. That's the nature of their relationship from the very beginning, from the sort of get-go. And I think when they were working towards getting Henry's marriage to Catherine annulled prior to their own marriage, they were kind of united by this force, that they had this shared goal, and they had dreams, how they were going to change the country, how they were going to have a room full of babies, of a room full of princes to carry on the Tudor line. And it was lots of kind of hope, I suppose. And I think there may have been the idea that once they were married, that the opposition would stop, that it would ease off. And of course, it doesn't. So there is a kind of, I think what's going on is that his affection for her is starting to erode, basically. So there's nothing outright, apart from a few little arguments that they have, but then even Chapuis says, oh, it's nothing. They quickly recover and they quickly, back to their normal selves. But the pressures are mounting, and you can't help but feel that at some point something is going to give.
No, I mean, I think their relationship is obviously it's a really interesting one because of where it kind of springs from, the longevity of the courtship. But I think they both had an unrealistic view of what would happen for the marriage. I think there was so much opposition pre-marriage. I'm not sure why they weren't expecting it after the marriage as
Yes.
well. It was
Yeah, I
gonna
think because
happen.
Henry just doesn't, he cannot abide any sort of disobedience or opposition. And I think he does create these kind of fantasies in his head about what things are going to be like. And when they don't perfectly match that fantasy, that is when people die. People end up on the scaffold because he believes that his will is God's will. That's not just a sort of something we say, that is his actual belief. He's only answerable to God now. So this is a very complicated, complex man. And I think having a relationship with him is going to be incredibly difficult.
No, I completely agree with you. Am I correct in saying at this time that he's imprisoned Thomas More and Bishop Fisher, some of his oldest friends?
Yes, he has, absolutely. So I think Thomas More was in prison for around a year before he was executed. There was considerable effort made to kind of turn him around. I think 4 or 5 times, a series of Thomases. It was like Thomas Cromwell, Thomas Risley, Thomas, I don't even know who. There were so many Thomases that went to him to try to convince him to agree to the king's supremacy, but he just wouldn't. He just wouldn't. And that's very difficult, because although we might question some of Thomas More's behaviors and actions today, rightfully, I think, he was very well respected and liked by a lot of people at court. And as you've mentioned, he is one of the king's oldest, and I'm going to say friends very loosely because I don't know that Henry had any friends, but you know what I mean. So I think that was a real shock. One of the first, there was lots of shocks in 1535. Henry is executing left, right, and center. He is coming down with the full force of the law, the new acts of treason, supremacy, succession. They've all just come in 1534. So things are changing. There's a lot of kind of fear and doubt and suspicion and confusion as to what's going on. But the execution of Thomas More and the execution, as you've mentioned, of John Fisher, days, literally days after he'd been made a cardinal by Pope Paul III, left not just England, but I think all of Catholic Europe kind of just in absolute shock and reeling and really wanting justice for them.
No, I think obviously Henry's, as you say, was a very complex man, and I don't think we'll ever truly understand him or his motives in anything. But I do find it sad that he started to execute his friends, as you say, loosely friends. And I think people forget he would have done that to Thomas Wolsey as well if he got to the
Yeah,
tower.
well, exactly. Wolsey's a very interesting what if, isn't he? I tend to agree with you. I don't think Wolsey would have been safe just because of the long relationship with the king, because as we see, nobody was safe. Literally, there was no one safe. And in fact, I would argue that the closer you were to Henry, the more unsafe you actually were, because when he looks to blame, he's looking very close to the throne. Hence, Thomas Wyatt, thunder rolls around the throne. That's exactly right. That's where his little beady eyes stop on somebody that's quite close to him, because he's quite suspicious, and he becomes increasingly paranoid as he becomes more unwell in terms of physical illness and whatnot. And it's a scary place to be, the Tudor court.
Yeah, I used to say that, yeah, I'd like to go back. I don't think I would. I don't think
Maybe
I'd
just to watch
survive.
like a fly on the wall, but not
Yeah,
not
be one of the watchers at Hampton Court on the ceiling.
yeah.
Could you explain the relationship between Anne and, at the time, Henry's side man, Thomas Cromwell?
Wow, that's a very interesting relationship, that one, isn't it? My goodness. All right. So this is one of those areas where I think there is still a lot of misconceptions about their relationship. Uh, like I say, I delved into so many documents. There was nothing to me that proved that there was anything other than a working relationship between Cromwell and Anne. In fact, I don't think they liked each other very much, to be honest, but they put up with each other while the king needed and wanted the two of them around. So theirs is a very complex relationship as well. And to kind of get to the origins, we have to go back to around 1528, basically. And Cromwell is, of course, incredibly loyal to Thomas Wolsey, the man you've just mentioned. That's where he kind of gets he gets his start in somebody else's household. But then Wolsey really does kind of, he's kind of molding him as his protege or his successor, is basically what Wolsey was doing. So Cromwell's incredibly loyal to Thomas Wolsey. And I'm sure your listeners have probably heard that Anne Boleyn and her kind of allies had something to do with Wolsey's downfall. We can debate how much Anne actually had to do with that, but we know she had something to do with it. So I don't think actually Cromwell ever forgave her for that. And I think a really potent piece of evidence in regards to that is that Cromwell actually embeds elements of Wolsey's heraldry into his own, which I think is a real kind of slap in the face to Anne and the Boleyns. And he's basically saying where his loyalties lie. Now, there's this idea that perhaps Anne patronized Cromwell or something like that. No, so definitely Thomas Cranmer, we can say, owed his rise to the Boleyns and to Anne's patronage, not Thomas Cromwell. There's this idea that, because he helped with the refurbishing of the apartments at the Tower before Anne's coronation that they were best buddies. But no, that's only because Henry actually asked him to do that. And he is always Henry's man, never Anne's man. He's the king's man. And I guess one of the most, wow, like obvious, blatant things that Anne did to Cromwell is that I think there's different sources that have different numbers, but there were, up to 70, 80 men knighted at her coronation. Thomas Cromwell was not one of them. Now, I think Diarmaid MacCulloch called it a calculated snub, and I have to completely agree with him. I think there's no other way of interpreting that. There's all sorts of men being knighted at Anne's coronation. Had they been the close allies that some people have suggested they were, he would have been knighted. The other thing to consider is that he is not raised to the peerage until after Anne's execution. That's when he really takes off. Once Anne is gone, it is like she was curtailing his complete rise. He was very powerful, of course, but I think she was putting the brakes on. And so that's why we see him kind of explode after it. He's got, there's no end to his power after Anne's executed. So even as early as, I think it's June 1535, he's telling Chapuis, and Chapuis's reporting it to the emperor, that Anne is threatening him, saying that, she's going to have his head off and all sorts of things like this. This is not a close friendship. This is a very tense relationship, but they are both so incredibly intelligent and politically savvy that they kind of keep it under, kind of underground. It doesn't really bubble up too often until, of course, he knows that he has Henry's protection, and then it's all out warfare with Anne.
No, I agree. I think it's another misconception that they were friends and Cromwell betrayed her. I don't think, as you say, he was ever her friend. He was the king's man, and before that, he was Thomas Wolsey's man.
Absolutely.
Never Anne's or the Boleyns.
No, and I wonder how this story would have ended had he been had he had the same kind of love and loyalty that Cranmer, for example, had for Anne. I wonder if in the end, I don't think it would have, because Henry was in charge. However, I do sometimes think, would he have tried to help somehow? I don't know. Perhaps would he have pushed for her being sent to a nunnery rather than execution? Maybe, but sadly, we'll never know.
No, sadly not. Do you think it was Anne's mistake to go against Cromwell so openly as she did?
Yeah, so there is an instance in April 1536 where she makes a very, very public attack on him. It's a very famous and controversial sermon that her almoner delivers at court, and she basically the idea, it's a biblical story that he draws on, and he compares Cromwell, well, not overtly, but everybody knows, to Haman, who is the biblical traitor who's executed for, kind of convincing the king King Ahasuerus to make a bad decision. So this is a very open attack, a very public attack on Cromwell. And I do think, because I tried so hard to work out when this turned deadly for Anne, when it went from just perhaps getting rid of her in some way to actually executing her. And I think that around that time is when Cromwell perhaps came up with the idea that a more permanent removal of Anne and her closest allies was required, because of how formidable she was, because of how fearless she was, how courageous she was. It's not someone, I don't think, that you can pack away to a nunnery. I really don't. I think she would have fought it. And I think her brother, for example, which is why he had to go as well, I think he would have stood up for her as well. So it's a very, very complex relationship, that one.
No, it isn't. I think it could be just a whole episode on its own discussing their
Yeah, it could
relationship.
be. Absolutely.
Going back a little bit, the summer progress of 1535 is kind of, well, it is for me, is the kind of last kind of happiness of Henry and Anne's relationship. And I thought, would you like to discuss a little bit where they went on that progress? And did they meet anyone significant on that progress?
Yeah, you're right. There's a sense that there's a bit of a relief here. It's, the kind of eye in the storm type thing. There's still a lot going on, of course, but there's a sense that they are trying to get away from it all. And And so you can kind of breathe a little bit during this point, and even when I was writing it, I found like, oh, great. Okay, I've got some nice things to kind of cover. So the 1535 progress departs on the 9th. It's around the 9th of July. And it is literally days just after Thomas More's execution. So again, there is a huge amount of opposition, and from Catholic Europe, it's not good. It's not looking good for Henry on that side. They were planning around 3 months. So they were going to depart and travel through the West Country to Bristol and then kind of circle back and come back to Windsor Castle. In the end, they don't actually get back to Windsor until I think it's around the 25th of October. So 4 months, they extended the trip by 1 month. And that is because they were having such a magnificent time, to be honest. That is what all the evidence points to, what all the evidence suggests. So there's lots of they go to about 26, 27 different locations. So I won't mention them all, but except to say that there are groups of places. So they stay at religious houses. They always stay at monastic houses on progresses. That's very common. That's been done since, Henry VII was on the throne, because they have the abbot's lodgings, which are very comfortable, and they take them over when they arrive. So they stay at religious places like Abingdon Abbey, Reading Abbey, Tewkesbury Abbey. They stay with courtiers. Basically, they stay with people who, I was going to say support the wedding, but that might be going a bit far. So maybe they stay with people who didn't openly oppose Henry's marriage to Anne. Let's put it that way. And some, of course, are reformers and are kind of aligned with Anne Boleyn. They also stay at many royal properties, so places that people will recognize that you can still visit today, like Sudeley Castle, Thornbury Castle, Berkeley Castle. They stay at the Old Palace of Langley, which sadly is only reduced to a very small amount, which is a private dwelling today, but all those others you can visit. So it's a mixture, like all progresses, of business and pleasure. So there's still, business that needs to be done. Of course, your household needs to be looked after. So we see Anne writing letters to do with wardships and different appointments that she's made. So there's certainly still that going on. That doesn't end. However, there's a lot of riding and hunting and hawking and music. So I think that during this time, they were able to reconnect. It was a little bit like going back to when they first got together, and they were doing all of that. The weather was okay. It was a bit rainy in points, but it was all right. So they were able to get out into the gardens. They would literally spend the entire day in the saddle from like 6 a.m. until 10 p.m. at night, often, returning once the sun had set. So long days in the saddle, which actually shows how fit it was as well. Incredible stamina. So they're visiting people, as you mentioned. So, for example, they go to Acton Court, they visit St Nicholas Points, we believe. He went as far as building a whole new wing to welcome Anne and Henry. So people go out of their way to create something quite special when you've got obviously the king and queen coming. Points by his family had been supporters of Catherine. However, he appears to have been a little bit more flexible and was quite happy to have Anne there. They then went to his aunt and uncle's house, actually, the home of the Walshes, which is called Little Sodbury Manor, just today a private home. Beautiful, gorgeous little home I got to visit once, which was really lovely. So they're staying with people that have important positions at court. So, for example, they stay with the William Lord Sandys at the Vine. They stay at Basing House with Sir William Paulet. So these men have important positions in Henry's household. They, of course, famously go to Wolf Hall to stay with the Seymours. Now, maybe just to pause here a moment to say that there is absolutely no evidence that anything happened here in terms of Henry and Jane's relationship. In fact, we can't even be 100% sure that Jane was there. I think she probably was in service to Anne, but we actually don't have any documentary evidence to prove that. So that's a bit of conjecture, but I think it's likely she probably was. Anything maybe that did happen is that Henry really enjoyed his time with Jane's brother. So he plans to visit him, and that's Edward Seymour, plans to visit him a little bit later on the progress, but plans change and they end up going somewhere else. So I suppose that's the other important thing to say. There's an itinerary that goes out at the beginning, but that itinerary gets changed depending on weather, on plague. They didn't get to Bristol in the end because there was a serious case outbreak of the plague. So they stayed at Thornbury instead. So they're always adapting and changing depending on what's happening to make sure that, of course, the royal party is safe. But there is an important kind of centerpiece to this progress, and it is the consecration that happens on the 19th of September at Winchester Cathedral. And Edward Fox, John Hilsey, and Hugh Latimer are all consecrated as bishops. So this is important because they were all men that Anne patronized. They were supporters of Anne. So this is really a big slap in the face to everyone that had kind of not been supporting her up until this point. And Henry and Anne are almost certainly at the ceremony, as are every other kind of important noble person as well, because Henry wanted everyone around him to show that he had the support of the nobility. So there's there's so much going on. And we know that they're enjoying themselves because there are probably at least 5 or 6 letters that say the king and queen are merry, and they're having a great time hunting and hawking. They extend the trip. As I mentioned, they were meant to take 1 week on the return journey that ended up taking a month. And perhaps the most important piece of evidence is that when Anne returns to Windsor, she is pregnant again.
I mean, there's a bit to not unpack, but obviously it's a nice few months for Anne, I think.
It is, yeah.
Would you say because of this progress, things definitely improved for Henry and Anne, even if it was temporary?
Yeah, I think it was. And I think, when you're out of your normal routine and you're out of your kind of normal surroundings, I don't know, things feel a little bit more hopeful. So I think that is what happened to them. I think they were with their favorites. They were surrounded by their favorite people. They were connecting with each other again. We know that there's accounts of the musicians playing. As I've said, there's card games. There's all sorts of games. They played so many games. Both of them loved it. There's a lot of pastime in good company, basically, which I think led to, yes, a renewed sense of intimacy between the two. Of course, there's all that still going on, all the terrible stuff going on. There's still the threat of a Catholic invasion that was very real. We know that, of course, Francis and Charles never got it together enough to actually enforce what the Pope was threatening, because I didn't mention earlier, the Pope was threatening Henry with excommunication and with a bull of deprivation, which would basically take his throne off him had it been enforced. But the Pope didn't have anyone willing to do it. But of course, we know that, but Henry doesn't know that. So there's a real threat that there's going to be an invasion. There's a threat they're going to lose very viable trade routes because of it. So the general public and the people are very scared. They're very worried. There's been a terrible there was a real rainy season after winter, and basically the crops all failed. So there was a kind of famine, to be honest, and there was huge inflation when it came to bread and all sorts of things. So there was a lot going on that wasn't pleasant, but I think they just escaped it for a little while during this progress.
No, completely. So moving to the winter of 1535, early 1536, during Anne's queenship, Catherine of Aragon is in exile and is not having a very good time. She's treated appallingly.
Yeah, she
And
is.
sadly, Catherine of Aragon does die on the 7th of January, 1536. And I don't know if you agree, but I think when Catherine of Aragon dies, this opens the space for Anne to also fall victim. I don't think it's a good thing that Catherine of Aragon dies. Catherine of Aragon kind of shielded getting rid of Anne, and I don't know if you agree.
Yeah, I completely agree. That's exactly actually what I kind of argue in my book, that strangely enough, this is why this story, you just can't make this story up. While Catherine was alive, Anne Boleyn was safe. She was protected. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is that Henry was blaming Catherine for everything that was going wrong. She was the reason why all this opposition was coming up against them. She was the reason why there was no kind of rest. It was because of her. It was because the emperor wanted to get her back on the throne, basically. And so once Catherine's gone, Henry is, of course, looking for somebody else to blame, because these problems don't stop. They're still there. So that's when he obviously decides that Anne is actually the one that's the cause of his problems. The other reason is, of course, if while Catherine's still alive, he wants to rid himself of Anne, this is very complicated because what happens if he annuls his marriage? Then basically it's like an acknowledgement that, oh, actually, yeah, you're right, Catherine, the Pope, everyone was right, Henry was wrong, you should never have married Anne. Or it might be seen as acknowledging the Pope's authority if he gets rid of Anne, because that's exactly what the Pope wanted him to do. So he was kind of stuck in this spot where really, I don't think he would have done it with Catherine still alive, because people would have called for him to return to her. And he was just never going to do that either. So you're absolutely right. With her death, there are all these new options that hadn't been there before that suddenly come to light and that can be now explored by him and Thomas Cromwell.
No, I completely agree. I think it opens more unfavorable options to Anne.
Yeah.
Obviously you mentioned Anne was pregnant again in the autumn 1535, but sadly we do know that she loses it at the end of January 1536. Do you think this was the beginning of the end for Anne? When she lost the baby, this was Henry didn't see a way going forward for their future.
Yeah, it's such a heartbreaking month. January is so difficult. It's such a difficult month to research and write about because it is just constant kind of disaster after disaster. So following Catherine of Aragon's death, there's a brief, I suppose, respite where for I don't know, a few hours, she's the only queen. So, of course, she's kind of celebrating that fact, not celebrating Catherine's death, but celebrating the fact that she is the only queen. And this has not happened her entire reign. This is the first time, but then quickly realizes that now she's even in a more vulnerable position than she was before. You know, we have Henry has an accident in the tilt yard. He's not jousting officially or anything like that. He's just training. He just falls off his horse and I suppose his pride is severely, severely injured in that moment. And unfortunately, the accident almost certainly happened in front of the men that will very soon end up on the scaffold. So there's a real sense that there's a turning point at that moment when the king has that particular accident. Not long after, it would be within a few days, Anne begins to experience a miscarriage, unfortunately. We don't know if it was a spontaneous one. My feeling says that it was a long miscarriage, unfortunately, just because of pieces of evidence that we have in documentary evidence. Um, it is a heartbreaking situation because we have evidence of Anne consoling her ladies that are completely distressed for her. Of course, they know that this is not a good thing. This is going to be very challenging now with the king. Henry basically deserts her, doesn't care that she's just lost their baby, and leaves her and goes to Whitehall. So they're apart now. They're usually never apart, but they do spend some time apart. On the surface, things still look okay. You know, she's still getting property given to her by acts of parliament. She's still queen. She's still presiding over things. However, there's definitely something going on now in the background. So February, around the middle of February, is the first time we hear of Jane Seymour. That's the first time that we hear of her, sorry, in connection with Henry VIII, I should say. So that is definitely not a good sign. We have other things that sort of things kind of start unraveling, if you know what I mean. Like there's George Boleyn is actually put forward to become a knight, and he doesn't get the appointment. Somebody else gets it that's not very favorable to Anne. So there's all little things going on that don't look so good. You know, we've got that sermon that I mentioned, the controversial sermon. So we've now got Cromwell completely alarmed. He actually retreats, saying that he's really unwell. But in fact, he retreats to kind of get the plan ready with, I believe, with the king's permission. He's been given permission to now, you know, get rid of her, basically. So that's what he's doing. He's collecting evidence and he's doing all sorts of things. So it's, you know, you can't help when you're studying this and when you're reading about it, but feel that, yeah, that things are on the way down, and that, you know, that she's being trapped, I suppose, is the feeling I got, that slowly she's being trapped, and that she kind of senses it, but she wants to fight it at the same time because that's her nature. So it's quite heartbreaking from now on.
No, I completely agree. I hate if I've got to research for anything or do a post on it. She's like, oh no, this is just such a horrible.
Yeah, it really is. It really is.
Moving to April 1536,
Yes.
obviously we're feeling a few rumblings around court. There's nothing definitive to say, this is going to happen, but something's definitely going
Yeah.
on in the background.
Yeah, definitely. April is where I started to feel really stressed, to be honest. So, after the Passion Sunday sermon, and we've got Chapuis. Oh, sorry, I did forget to mention, of course, Chapuis' famous visit to Greenwich Palace, which happens on the 18th of April. So this is the one that we've seen fictionalized a lot on screen and whatnot, where apparently Chapuis tricked into acknowledging Anne, that whole thing. There's no trick. Chapuis, actually, there are two letters where he absolutely says that he's just returned Anne's acknowledgement of him. There's absolutely no trick. He just did the right thing because Anne is queen. So he returned her reverences, mutual reverence, as he calls them. This is an incredible day. It's a full day at court. Everybody's there. It ends up, I'm not going to go through the whole day, but it ends up with Henry giving Cromwell a severe and very public dressing down. So he basically accuses him of having negotiated with the emperor without his knowledge, even though that's completely erroneous. Henry has been, has known that Cromwell has been negotiating with the emperor the whole time, but basically does a Henry on him and just, turns the tables. So again, following the Passion Sunday sermon where Cromwell was thinking he was okay because he thought he had Henry's protection, we now find Cromwell feeling incredibly vulnerable and concerned because he realizes that Henry's protection means nothing because he can literally withdraw it from you in a moment, which is what we see him do very soon with a lot of people. So there's that particular day, and now Cromwell, I think, is even more intent than ever for a permanent removal of Anne. There is the St. George's Day chapter meeting that I mentioned where George doesn't get his appointment, sadly, and it goes to Sir Nicholas Carew, who is no Anne lover or supporter. So, there's a sense that the Boleyns are perhaps on the way out and that there's other new people coming in. But I think the most kind of drastic thing that happens in April is that there are two commissions of Oyer and Terminer set up to investigate certain crimes. Now, I should point out that some people debate whether Henry actually ordered these or whether this was Cromwell. They're certainly in Henry's name, but that doesn't, I suppose, confirm that Henry, did order them. I think he did order them, but there is a debate about that, and they include investigations into suspected treasons. However, they do not mention anybody by name or what the actual treason is. So it's still a bit up in the air. Some people say, "Oh no, this wasn't related to the whole Anne Boleyn thing." I think, of course, it was related because it was in Kent and Middlesex, which is exactly where the crimes were said to have taken place. So that is like, yeah, a very, very bad omen. But it kind of keeps going. It gets worse. We have then Anne obviously knows something is going on. She's very observant. She's very clever. So she reaches out on around the 26th of April to Matthew Parker, her chaplain. We don't know what exactly was said, but it does appear that she entrusted Elizabeth's care to him and her religious well-being to him. So she's afraid. She knows that something's going down, but she doesn't know exactly what. The council are spending literally the whole day and night locked behind closed doors. People are commenting on it. They don't know what's going on. What are they discussing? Is it something to do with Europe? Is it to do with home? So there's, the tension is building. It's like this boiling pot, and you're just waiting for something to actually happen.
No, I think you've explained that brilliantly, and it is just absolutely heartbreaking to hear and talk about. And from what you've said, you know that from April that she's not going to come out of this alive.
Yeah, you know what, Jessica, I think that because it was something that had never happened before, Anne was an anointed queen. This is not even just a queen. This is somebody that's been anointed, really only natural death was supposed to remove that title from her, nothing else, So I don't know that anyone actually quite believed that she would be executed until quite late in the piece. I don't even think Anne thought it until George had been executed, and then I think she understood that was the end for her. But I feel like this was something so unusual and so brutal, even in a century that has so much brutality. And if we think of Charles V, Francis I, they also did quite awful things, but not to this level. I think Henry was more brutal even than them. Even in terms of his own contemporaries, he stands out to me as somebody that is, oh, yeah, capable of really awful acts. And so I wonder if people still thought, oh, maybe he's just testing her, or maybe he's going to, lock her away somewhere in exile, and he's just punishing her for a little bit and sending her to the Tower. However, I think once George was executed and the other man, that kind of hope left. And I did forget to mention that as well. Towards the end of April, Parliament is summoned again, and the Reformation Parliament had only just closed a few weeks, I think, before that. So this was definitely a sign that something was going to happen that was going to require parliamentary acts to support it. So this is something big, really big.
No, completely. Obviously, going into May 1536, Anne is arrested on the 2nd of May. Mark's meeting, I think, was the 1st of May,
Yeah,
1536.
I think he was probably the first actually to be questioned and arrested and sent to the Tower.
And obviously, George is also the 2nd of May, 1536, and then the rest follow. If you can, what were the last 3 weeks of Anne's life like?
Yeah, I think it was a bit up and down, to be honest with you. It was, if we think of everything she'd just gone through that particular year, starting with losing her baby and all the stress and the pressure and the not knowing and the wondering, I just feel like part of her may have been a bit relieved that it had finally happened. She's been waiting for this. She's been expecting something to happen. I don't think she could have imagined what was about to happen, but so there's that. I think she would have been completely exhausted. I think she was probably on the verge of a mental breakdown if she hadn't had one already. So very alone, which is what breaks my heart. Yeah, she's got women there serving her, but they're essentially spies. Anne herself says these are not her favorite women. They're not women from her privy chamber. It's like Kingston's wife and other, like James Boleyn's wife, an aunt that she never got along with. So a Mistress Stoner that we're not too sure exactly who the Mistress Stoner was. There's a few possibilities. So there's women there that at the beginning I don't think were very caring for her. They weren't caring for her. They were just doing their job, spying, whatnot. So our source of information for this period are the letters of William Kingston. So he's the Constable of the Tower. He's recording everything and he's sending everything to Thomas Cromwell. So essentially they're spying on Anne. And he often says things like, oh, she kind of started laughing about this. I've never seen anyone laugh in this position. So you can tell that emotionally she was a little bit all over the place. As soon as she gets in there, she kind of litters him with questions. Where's my brother? Where's my mother? Where's my father? She wants to know what's happening. And she starts babbling. She does, I suppose, what anyone would do in a situation where you actually don't know why you've been imprisoned. So Tudor prisoners, they're never told what, they don't know. Even when they get to court, that's kind of when they first to trial, when they hear, oh, okay, these are the charges against you. I think she had some idea of maybe a few of the people that were involved because she mentions it, but I don't think she knew the full extent of what she was being accused of. So she is babbling. She's trying to work it out. She's like, oh, was it when I spoke to Mark Smeaton that day? So she's incriminating herself and others by complete accident just because she's trying to make sense of the situation. And then she said, oh, maybe it was that time where I spoke to Sir Henry Norris. And so so they're noting down what Anne's saying, passing it on, and men are getting arrested. So she mentions um, Francis Weston at one point. He's arrested, the next day. We don't know exactly about William Brereton. The letter doesn't survive where she mentions him. So, but he was arrested. Thomas Wyatt was imprisoned and Richard Page were imprisoned. Although the latter two, they were set free. There was nothing. They were never tried, actually. So it's such a heartbreaking time because she is at some points in hope of life. She says it. She has dinner with William Kingston. I think she had dinner with him most days, actually. And she had seen Thomas Cranmer that day. And we're not quite sure what went on, but it appears that Cranmer maybe offered her a bit of a deal if you agree to an annulment. you're going to be sent to a nunnery, because that same afternoon when she was having dinner, she said, oh, I'm in hope of life. I might be sent, to a nunnery. And Kingston recorded all of this. I don't know if Cranmer was kind of tricking her or whether he was tricked as well by Henry, who probably said, oh, yeah, no, offer it to her. Definitely. And so that's a little bit unclear. But so she sees no one. She doesn't see her brother again. She doesn't see her family. She doesn't see Elizabeth. It is a very lonely time for her, where so many thoughts must have been like going through her head. She is treated, yes, I suppose, as queen. She's imprisoned, not in any dungeon. She's in the Queen's apartments at the Tower of London, the same place where she spent, the days before her coronation. So this is psychological, I think, abuse of her as well, because not only does she know that she's heading for something quite awful physically, but she's tormented by these thoughts of the good old days, when she was about to give birth to at that point she thought the prince and all of that. So there's so many levels of challenges for her during that time. We don't know that she got to write to Henry. There was a request. She made a request. There is a letter that survives that is very kind of controversial. Some people are adamant it is Anne's. It's not Anne's writing, but that it's Anne's sentiment. Other people say no, absolutely not. It was, created in Elizabethan period. So we know that on the 12th of May, the men, apart from George, are all tried and they're all found guilty. They all plead not guilty. Only Smeaton pleads guilty to having actually committed adultery with Anne, but he pleads not guilty to all the other charges. Doesn't matter. It's a foregone conclusion. They're all found guilty and they're going to be hung, drawn, and quartered unless the king commutes that sentence. On the 13th of May, Anne's household is broken up. So let's think about this. She hasn't even been tried yet, and her household is already broken up. We know that Jane Seymour is brought closer to the king the following day. So she's being already prepared for queenship as well. And then on the 15th is the incredible trial of Anne, and then followed by George Boleyn in the Great Hall at the Tower of London, where they show their mettle and they show why they are so formidable. People are taking bets at George's trial that he's going to escape it, because he's just answered everything so cleverly. And let's remember that they don't know the full charges till they actually get there. So they were so impressive, the two of them. And, I think that's partly why Henry gets rid of them, because he felt diminished by them, by their brilliance. He could never keep up with them. It was just not possible. So unfortunately, they are both found guilty, regardless of no evidence, no witnesses. As far as we know, no testimonies, absolutely nothing. It is just all rumor and hearsay that condemns them. And most of the charges, to be honest, I've done it myself. I've looked through all of them, can be disproved. Either Anne wasn't there or the man wasn't there, or, but they didn't care. That wasn't important to the crown. What was important is just proving how heinous Anne's behavior had been, and how, she'd turned into this voracious kind of sexual beast after marrying Henry for some reason, and decided to have all these affairs that caused the king physical harm. Because, of course, adultery is not a crime here. It's not punishable by death, I should say. It's the treason that's very important. So Henry has to be affected by this physically. It's heartbreaking, Jessica. I could go on and on and on, but it's and we know what, of course, happens in the end.
No, it absolutely, I could feel myself tearing up. That's so ridiculous, but it is just so heartbreaking and
It is
absolutely awful. I mean, it really is. It's awful, and I think if you could go back in time, I would give him a good old slap, Henry.
I don't think you're the only one. I think
No.
there'd be a big lineup.
I was gonna say, I think there'd be a big queue and we're all paying someone to go give him a slap. Before I let you go, because obviously I've taken quite a bit of your time, I like to ask my guests fun Tudor questions.
Ooh, like it.
So my first one is, have you got a Tudor pet peeve?
Oh, Tudor pet peeve. So is this in terms of like something that I don't like that the Tudors do, or something that people say about the Tudors?
So usually it's something that people have said about the Tudors that really bugs you.
All right. Oh, I've got lots. Let me think. Which one am I going to go? You can spend another half an hour talking about. I think I think I'm going to go with, because we're talking about obviously Anne Boleyn and Henry, the claim that people make that Anne stole him from Catherine of Aragon. I think that I'm going to go with this one because it relates to what we've been discussing. I wholeheartedly disagree with that statement, basically.
No, no, I do. I could have a little debate with people when they when they say
Yeah,
it to me. Have
exactly.
Have you got a favorite either history book or Anne Boleyn book that you'd recommend to others?
Oh, that's such a good question. I think my favorite still remains and has to be The Life and Death of Anne Boleyn by Eric Ives. I do not actually agree with everything that Ives claims or states. However, that's absolutely makes no difference. It is, I think, still the most incredible biography, the most detailed, the most well-researched biography of Anne Boleyn. He devoted his life to Anne and was such a lovely man, apart from an excellent academic, and literally devoted his life to Anne. That book took him, he did a first version of it and then updated it a little bit later. So I recommend people get the updated version, which I think is from around 2004, I think, roughly around there. So yeah, I just love that how much he cared for his subject. And unlike some other academics that are a little bit cold towards their subject, he was very much happy to kind of talk about her as though she was a family member. So I really loved that about him, how accessible he is too. So it is an academic biography. However, it is really readable. It's really readable and it's very accessible. And he's been very careful with his notes. So you can certainly fall into about a million different rabbit holes by reading that book.
No, I mean, I love the Eric Ives biography. It's the Anne Boleyn Bible, I think, for many.
Yeah, that's what they say.
Have you got a favorite portrayal of Anne Boleyn on screen?
Ooh, that's a tough one. Hmm. I, I think it remains Geneviève Bujold from Anne of the Thousand Days. It's of course not completely historically accurate. However, I think she captures something of Anne's spark, of her vivacity, of her that something that was impossible to replicate, even though other women tried. She just we of course Geneviève is incredibly beautiful. We know Anne, as they say, wasn't the handsomest woman in the world and certainly didn't really fit in with the ideas of beauty in the 16th century. However, it was her sharp, wit, her intelligence that really made her stand out. And I think Geneviève does a great job of capturing that, and also her feisty side. I just love how feisty that Anne Boleyn is. And she gives Henry good telling offs. And, I know we all wish that Anne had had the opportunity to do that.
Now, I was going to say Geneviève Bujold is my favorite Anne Boleyn. And I agree with you again. She captures that spark that
Yeah.
is so enigmatic of Anne Boleyn that I don't think other actresses have caught of Anne Boleyn. And obviously, there's been a few portrayals when it comes to
There's
Anne
been quite a
Boleyn.
few.
My final question is, have you got a favourite fact about either Anne Boleyn or the Tudors?
Wow, that's a good question. Have I got a favorite fact? I probably got quite a few favorite facts, but now my brain's like, do I have a favorite fact? Oh, actually, I know what I'm going to go. I'm sticking with my Anne Boleyn theme, and I'm going to incorporate George into this one because I am a huge George Boleyn fan. So at one point, George, which is quite amazing, rides. So he rides his horse from Dover to Greenwich Palace in one day. So he does this in one day just to deliver a piece of information to Anne that he knows is going to be quite upsetting, and he doesn't want anybody to get there first. So he goes to all that effort. He would have had to have several changes of horse. When he arrives at Greenwich, he doesn't go to Henry. He goes to Anne first, which is absolutely, I think, just shows the extent of their relationship, how much he admired her, how much he cared for her, because he didn't want this information being delivered by anybody else in a callous manner. He wanted to deliver it to his sister in a way that, was hopefully not going to be as hurtful. It was just about negotiations in France that were not going to plan. And I love this about George, that he rode a horse for the whole day for his sister. I just think, I'd love to have a brother like that.
No, absolutely. I think their relationship is so special. And they were both just so brilliant.
They
Do you
were. They
do you
really
think
were.
do you think you'd ever write a book on George Boleyn and Anne?
Well, that's a good question. I don't know if there would be sufficient material, would be my concern. I know people have, of course, written about George, but in terms of their relationship, there is quite a bit. Well, you never know. I might think about it, Jessica, just because you've mentioned.
I mean, thank you for coming on today
Very
and chatting
welcome.
to me. I know I've taken a bit of your evening.
No, no, absolutely fine. I love to talk Tudors, so it's all good.
Well, I love doing it myself. I talk about them a bit too often if you ask family members.
I know what you mean.
But thank you very much, and I hope you have enjoyed talking about the wonderful Anne Boleyn.
Oh, I certainly haven't. Thank you so much for inviting me onto the podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Her Story. If there's a historical woman who inspires you and you'd like to share her story on the podcast, we'd love to hear from you. Get in touch at unholytudor@gmail.com. Until next time, keep celebrating the incredible women who've shaped our world.